The strange disturbance in the snowstorm. Dr. Ethan Hale had always loved the isolation of his mountain cabin. Nestled in the heart of the frozen wilderness, it was a place where the world seemed to slow down, quieting its noise and chaos. Surrounded by towering pines, his home sat under a thick blanket of snow, untouched and serene. The wind outside howled like a living creature, shaking the branches of the trees, its icy fingers creeping through the cracks in the walls. Ethan leaned back in his old wooden chair, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. He had always preferred the simplicity of this life, away from the bustling cities and the complexities of modern civilization. Here, in the remote silence, he could think clearly, free from distractions. The only sounds in his cabin were the crackling of the fire in the stone hearth and the occasional creaking of the logs as the building settled. But tonight, the wind was different. It wasn't just the usual howl of the storm. It was something else, something more intense. Ethan's brow furrowed as he glanced out the window, watching the snow swirl in frenzied spirals, driven by gusts of wind that seemed to possess a life of their own. Suddenly, the sound of the wind was eclipsed by a deep, thunderous roar. It was unlike anything he had ever heard before, loud enough to rattle the windows in their frames, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. Ethan stood, startled, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his coat and boots, the need to investigate urging him forward. The storm outside was fierce, the snow sharp as it cut into his skin, but he pressed on, his eyes scanning the dark landscape as he trudged through the deep drifts. There was something calling to him, something urging him toward the source of the disturbance. As he crested a small ridge, he saw it, a strange, massive object lying half-buried in the snow. His breath caught in his throat as he took in the sight. The craft was sleek and angular, its blackened surface scorched by fire. Jagged red burns marked its body, but there was something otherworldly about its design. It wasn't just a ship. This was something unlike anything he had ever seen. The material wasn't metallic, but something far more complex, as if the ship was alive. Faint crimson lines pulsed across its surface, flickering erratically, as though the vessel itself was struggling to stay intact. Ethan's heart raced as he approached, a sense of unease gnawing at him. The air around the craft was thick with acrid smoke, mingling with the fierce winds of the storm. Pieces of twisted debris lay scattered across the snow, some of them glowing faintly as though they still held a strange residual heat. The sharp smell of burning metal mixed with something more chemical, almost toxic. Every instinct told him to turn back, to stay safe inside his cabin, but his medical training drove him forward. There was someone or something out there, and they might need help. He moved cautiously, picking his way through the wreckage. The wind howled around him, carrying with it the faintest sound, almost like a pained groan. His pulse quickened, and he tightened his grip on the strap of his medical bag. It was a sound that no human should be making. He followed the noise, weaving between twisted metal and shattered glass, and then he saw her, lying near the broken console of the wrecked ship, her body tangled in wires and debris. She was beautiful, in a way that felt both alien and familiar. Her skin was a deep, shimmering violet, almost glowing in the pale light of the storm. Her crimson hair, streaked with soot, spilled across her shoulders, damp with frost. She looked fragile, her clothes torn and stained, but there was something regal about her, even in her broken state. A jagged piece of metal had pierced her side, and a thick, glowing liquid oozed from the wound, staining the snow beneath her. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, revealing irises of fiery gold that shimmered like molten lava. Despite her evident pain, there was strength in her gaze, a defiance that refused to let her succumb to her injuries. Ethan's breath hitched as he crouched beside her. She was speaking, her voice weak but clear, carrying a strange melodic lilt. Her words were in English, but her accent was unlike any he had ever heard. It sent a shiver down his spine. "Help," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan's mind raced. Who was she? Where had she come from? But there was no time for questions. Her condition was critical. He had to act fast. He pressed his hand gently to the wound, feeling the strange warmth of her skin beneath his fingers. It was soft and more pliable than human skin, almost like it was made of something else entirely. "Don't worry. I'll help you," he said, his voice steady despite the flood of questions rushing through his mind. He carefully removed the piece of jagged metal from her side, noting how her skin seemed to recoil from the foreign object, as if it was alive. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry out. She gripped his wrist with surprising strength, her hand delicate but firm, her golden eyes locked on his as though she were trying to communicate something beyond words. "Careful," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "It will hurt." Ethan nodded, his face set in determination. Despite the urgency of the situation, he tried to be as gentle as possible, tearing strips from his scarf to fashion a temporary bandage. The glowing liquid from her wound coagulated quickly, forming a strange, shimmering crust as it sealed the injury. Ethan could only guess at its nature, but it seemed to be a kind of natural healing agent. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "We can't stay out here. The storm will kill us both." She nodded weakly, her breathing shallow. As he lifted her into his arms, he was struck by the weight of her body. Though she appeared fragile, there was a surprising density to her form, as though her body was made of something heavier than human flesh. She leaned against him, her golden eyes fluttering closed, and together they began the difficult trek back to the cabin. The storm raged around them, the wind slashing at their faces, but Ethan didn't stop. He couldn't. The distance back to his cabin felt endless, the snow heavy and unforgiving beneath his boots. By the time they reached the cabin, his legs were burning with exhaustion, and his breath came in ragged gasps. He kicked the door open, carrying her inside and gently lowering her onto the couch near the fire. He worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he cleaned her wound and wrapped it with more bandages. His thoughts kept returning to her strange beauty, her alien presence, and the feeling that he had just encountered something far beyond his understanding. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter, this moment, was only the beginning. The storm outside may have been fierce, but the storm inside him, this sense of wonder, of curiosity, and of something much greater, was just beginning to stir, unraveling the mystery of the stranger. Ethan sat back, his eyes never leaving the figure lying unconscious on his couch. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting warm, golden light across the room, yet the chill from the storm outside seemed to hang in the air. The strange woman, whoever she was, remained eerily still, her body unyielding to the warmth Ethan had carefully brought into the cabin. As the hours passed, Ethan worked meticulously, checking her vitals, making sure her bandages were secure, and observing the strange way her skin healed itself. Her wound, which had initially been a deep, glowing gash, seemed to close faster than any human wound could. The liquid that had seeped from her side had solidified into a glittering crust, almost as if it was alive. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen, and it unnerved him. Nothing about this woman, no, this being, was remotely human. Her breathing was steady, but her condition was still fragile. Her golden eyes had remained closed ever since he'd brought her inside, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder who she was. What had happened to her? Where had she come from? And most importantly, why was she here, on Earth, in the middle of a snowstorm? The storm outside continued to rage, the wind howling fiercely against the cabin walls. But inside, the silence between him and the mysterious woman was palpable. Ethan's thoughts raced, but he kept his focus on the task at hand. The foreignness of her injury and the strange glowing substance that had seeped from her wound left him with more questions than answers. Suddenly, a soft sound broke the silence. It was barely audible, but it caught Ethan's attention. He turned to see the woman's fingers twitch. Then her eyelids fluttered. She was waking up. Ethan stood quickly, his hands instinctively moving to check her condition. Her eyes opened slowly, revealing those mesmerizing golden irises. There was a flash of recognition in them, but also an intensity, an intelligence that spoke of far more than just the being lying before him. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice strained but still carrying that melodic lilt. Her accent was still strange, but now it seemed softer, more human. There was an urgency in her gaze as she looked around, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her eyes locked onto Ethan, and for a moment, they shared a brief, wordless understanding. "You're safe," Ethan said gently, trying to reassure her. "You're in my cabin. You were hurt, but I've treated your wound. You're going to be okay." Her eyes softened slightly, though the intensity never left. She tried to sit up, but a sharp gasp of pain escaped her lips as she collapsed back onto the couch, clutching her side. Ethan rushed to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder to keep her still. "Take it easy," he urged. "You're still healing. You need to rest." The woman's gaze shifted, scanning the room, and then she whispered, "You are human." Ethan's brow furrowed, his curiosity piqued. "Yes," he replied, "I am. You're not." A strange flicker passed through her eyes, something like recognition, but also something deeper. She seemed torn, as though she were trying to decide whether or not to trust him. Finally, she spoke again, her voice slow, careful. "I am not from here," she said softly. "But I am not so different." Ethan sat down beside her, trying to process her words. Her skin, the way it shimmered under the firelight, her hair that seemed to change color depending on the light. It all pointed to something not human, something alien. But her words, her expressions, even the way she spoke, it was as if she had some understanding of human life. "You're not human?" Ethan asked cautiously. "No," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a strange mixture of sadness and resolve. "I am of a different kind, from far away, a world beyond this one. She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I was on a mission, but something went wrong. The storm, it caught us by surprise." Ethan was silent for a moment, absorbing her words. She wasn't just some lost traveler. She was from another world, from beyond the stars. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made the gravity of the situation all the more real. "Your people," Ethan began, his voice laced with curiosity. "What happened? Why were you here? And why did your ship crash?" Her expression darkened, a shadow passing over her golden eyes. She looked away, her gaze distant as though recalling something painful. "We were attacked," she finally whispered. "Our ship was sabotage, a strike against my people. We were forced to abandon our course and crash land here. The storm, it took us off course." She shook her head, her voice quiet but steady. "I was the only one who survived." Ethan's mind raced. Sabotage. Attack. Her story was starting to feel less like an accident and more like part of something much larger. There were still so many questions that needed answering, but now wasn't the time. The woman's condition was fragile, and despite the strange healing properties she seemed to possess, she was still at risk. "You need to rest," Ethan said softly, his hand gently resting on her arm. "I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'll get you the help you need." The woman's gaze softened for a moment, her golden eyes locking onto his with a mixture of gratitude and something else, a quiet understanding that perhaps this human could help her in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "I will rest," she agreed, her voice faint, "but I cannot stay here forever. There is much I must do, and I need your help, Doctor." Ethan blinked in surprise. "My help? What do you mean?" Her eyes flashed with determination, a fire burning behind them despite the exhaustion in her body. "There is more to this than you know. My people need me, and your world will soon be caught in the crossfire. I must return, and I need your help to survive." Ethan swallowed, a feeling of dread creeping into his chest. Whatever she was involved in, it was much bigger than either of them. But he couldn't turn his back on her. Not now. Not after everything she had already been through. For the first time, Ethan realized that he wasn't just treating a wounded alien. He was about to become part of a much larger story. A story that stretched far beyond his quiet mountain retreat and into the vast, uncharted expanse of space. The unveiling of the hidden truth. The days that followed were a blur of silence and tension. Outside, the snowstorm raged on, its fury unchecked by the warmth inside Ethan's cabin. The mysterious woman, whose name, he had learned, was Alia, remained unconscious for most of the time, her breathing steady but slow. Ethan kept a watchful eye on her, tending to her wound and trying to make sense of the increasingly strange situation unfolding before him. He had treated injured soldiers, disaster victims, and countless others in his medical career, but nothing prepared him for the moment he was experiencing now. Alia was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Her body healed at a rate that defied logic, the injury on her side already a distant memory. The shimmering, almost liquid substance that had once seeped from her body now completely gone. It was as though her physiology was alien in every sense, both fragile and resilient, in ways he could hardly comprehend. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice raspy but clear. "I need to speak with you." Ethan, sitting in the worn armchair near the fire, quickly set aside his book and stood. He walked over to her, his steps slow, cautious. Though she had healed quickly, he couldn't ignore the weariness in her eyes, the kind that came from deep within, as though she carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. "What is it, Alia?" he asked, his voice soft but filled with concern. "You should rest." She shook her head, her long crimson hair falling like a silk curtain over her shoulders. "Rest is a luxury I can't afford right now. There are things I must tell you, things you need to understand if you're going to help me." Ethan sat beside her, his heart racing. He had a million questions swirling in his mind, but Alia's words held a quiet authority, and he knew better than to rush her. "I'm listening," he said, his voice steady. Alia hesitated for a moment, collecting her thoughts. The flickering light of the fire danced in her golden eyes as she finally spoke. "You think I'm the only one here, on your planet, in your world. But I am not. And I am not the only one who's been sent here." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Who else is here? Are there more of your kind?" Alia's gaze hardened. "Yes, there are more of us, but they are not here to help you." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He had assumed, from the very beginning, that Alia had come to Earth out of necessity, crash-landing after a disaster, stranded and in need of aid. But now it seemed that there was something far darker at play. "Why are you here, Alia?" he asked, his voice more urgent now, his medical training telling him to remain calm, but his instincts pushing him to understand. "What is going on?" Alia looked away, her eyes distant as though lost in thought. She paused, and then spoke again, her voice laced with both anger and sorrow. "The ship I was on was part of an intergalactic peacekeeping mission. My people, the Zetheri, are tasked with maintaining order across the stars. We've been watching your planet for some time. But someone, or something, has been sabotaging our efforts. We were attacked before we could complete our mission." Ethan's mind spun as he tried to process her words. A peacekeeping mission. Intergalactic. The implications were staggering. The woman in front of him was not just a survivor of a crash. She was part of something much larger, something beyond anything Ethan could have imagined. "Sabotaged," he repeated, trying to piece together the fragmented story. "By who?" Alia's eyes flashed with anger. "By the very people who claim to be your protectors. Those who govern your world, the ones who hold the power to shape your future. They are the ones who attacked us. They believe we, my people, are a threat to their control. They don't want peace. They want dominance." Ethan's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. If what Alia was saying was true, Earth was caught in a much larger game than he had ever thought possible. a game that involved powerful forces, both on Earth and beyond, manipulating the fates of entire worlds. But why Earth? Why not just leave? Ethan asked, his voice laced with disbelief. If you've been watching our planet, surely you know how fractured we are. Why come here? Alia's expression softened for a moment. Because your planet, your people, are the key. You are at a crossroads. Earth holds a unique position in the galaxy, a potential that no one has fully realized. My people came to offer help, to ensure that your world could join the galactic community and rise above the darkness that has enveloped it. But those who attacked us, they want to keep your planet in the shadows. They want you to remain isolated, unaware of the greater universe that exists beyond your sky. Ethan was silent, his mind reeling. Alia's words were not just a warning. They were a cry for help. And yet, she was here, stranded, her mission thwarted, and Earth was now in danger of being manipulated by forces beyond their understanding. And your people, they're still out there? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alia nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. Yes, they're still out there. And they need me to return. But I can't do it alone. I need your help, Doctor. Ethan looked into her eyes, the weight of her words settling in. His life had just been turned upside down. The simple life he had built here in the mountains, away from the chaos of the world, now seemed so distant, so irrelevant. He had thought that healing the wounded was his purpose, that saving lives was what mattered most. But now, as he stared into Alia's determined eyes, he realized that he was standing at the crossroads of something much larger, something that would require all of his strength, his intellect, and perhaps even his courage. I will help you, he said, his voice firm with resolve. Tell me what needs to be done. Alia's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Ethan saw the humanity behind her alien eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Together, we may be able to save your world. And with those words, Ethan knew that his life, and the fate of the Earth, would never be the same again. The burden of secrets. The days that followed were a whirlwind of strange conversations, cryptic warnings, and a growing sense of unease. Ethan's life, once confined to the quiet rhythms of his medical practice and the peaceful solitude of his mountain cabin, had been violently torn apart. Now, every moment he spent with Alia seemed to open up new layers of a truth too large for him to comprehend. Alia was slowly recovering, her strength returning in fits and bursts, though there was still an undeniable vulnerability about her. Despite the alien nature of her injury, how quickly it healed, how her body responded to the world around her. It was her mind that troubled Ethan the most. She was not just physically otherworldly. Her experiences, her knowledge, the things she had seen, they were beyond anything he could have imagined. And yet, she carried it all with a quiet grace, as if burdened by a secret too heavy to share. It was on the third evening after their conversation that Alia spoke of something deeper, something that had been eating away at her since the crash. Doctor, she began softly, breaking the silence that had enveloped the cabin. Ethan looked up from the medical journal he had been flipping through, his brow furrowed in concentration. There's something I haven't told you, something I should have said earlier, but I wasn't sure how. Ethan set the journal aside, sensing the seriousness in her voice. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in her expressions, the small tremors in her voice that signaled when she was about to reveal something important. He walked over to her, kneeling beside the couch where she now rested, looking far more like her true self. Commanding and regal, her golden eyes focused and intense. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Alia hesitated for a moment before speaking, her eyes momentarily drifting to the flickering flames of the hearth. "The attack on my people wasn't just random," she said. "It wasn't just a simple act of violence. It was part of something much larger, a conspiracy that threatens not just my kind, but your world as well." Ethan's stomach tightened. He could feel the weight of her words settling over him, pressing down on his chest. A conspiracy. The very idea seemed impossible, but Alia's tone left no room for doubt. She was not someone given to paranoia or idle talk. Whatever she was about to say, it had to be taken seriously. What kind of conspiracy? Ethan asked, his voice steady despite the growing anxiety gnawing at him. Alia's gaze hardened, her eyes narrowing as she stared into the fire, as if trying to piece together the fragments of a shattered puzzle. The people who attacked us are not just criminals or rogue elements. They are part of a much larger organization, a faction that operates in the shadows, pulling the strings of governments and corporations across the galaxy. They have infiltrated worlds like yours, and they've been manipulating your leaders for years. Their goal is control. They want power, and they'll stop at nothing to achieve it. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. He had always believed in the basic goodness of people. Even in the face of corruption and greed, he had held on to the hope that humanity could rise above it. But Alia's words painted a picture of a much darker reality. A conspiracy of this magnitude wasn't something he could easily dismiss. But why Earth? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why target us? Alia turned her gaze to him, her eyes burning with intensity. Because your planet is unique. It is the key. Earth holds resources, knowledge, and a strategic position in the galaxy that no one has fully understood until now. The organization that attacked us has been manipulating your leaders, pulling strings behind the scenes, making sure you remain isolated and unaware of the larger universe. They want to keep your planet in the dark, in ignorance, because once your world awakens, once you realize your potential, you will become a force that could disrupt everything they've worked to control. Ethan sat back, processing her words. His mind raced as he tried to fit the pieces together. Everything he thought he knew about the world, about the conflicts and powers at play in the global stage, now seemed like a smokescreen, an elaborate illusion. The real battles were being fought in the shadows, beyond the reach of ordinary people. And Earth, despite its isolation, was at the center of it all. This is bigger than anything I could have imagined, Ethan muttered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. Alia nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a sadness that made Ethan's chest ache. I know, and I'm not here just as a medic or a survivor of the crash. I was sent to prevent something catastrophic. But I failed. I've already seen the consequences of my failure. My people, my world, they're in danger because of the actions of this organization. Ethan looked at her, his eyes searching hers for any sign of weakness, any hint that this could be a misunderstanding. But there was none. Alia was not the kind of person to embellish the truth, and the sincerity in her voice told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just about one lost alien ship or a few rogue attackers. This was about the fate of entire civilizations and the survival of Earth itself. Can you stop them? Ethan asked, his voice firm despite the overwhelming fear rising in his chest. Can we stop them? Alia's eyes met his, filled with a quiet determination. It's possible, but not without help. I need you, Doctor. I need your knowledge of your planet, your resources, your people. I can't do this alone. Ethan stood up, pacing for a moment as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He had always been a healer, someone who fixed broken bodies, who patched up wounds. But this was a war, not of weapons, but of knowledge and power. It was a fight for the future of everything he knew. I'm not a soldier, Ethan said, his voice rough. I don't know how to fight in a war like this. You're already fighting, Alia replied, her voice soft yet resolute. By helping me, by understanding the truth, you've already chosen to stand against them. You've chosen to protect your world. Ethan turned to face her, her golden eyes locked on his with an unwavering gaze. For the first time since their strange meeting, he understood the gravity of what she was asking. He wasn't just a witness to an extraordinary event. He was now a part of it. His choices, his actions, would shape the future of his planet. The responsibility felt immense, but there was no turning back. "All right," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'll help you. But we need a plan. We need to understand who's behind all of this and how we can stop them." Alia smiled faintly, a rare flicker of relief in her eyes. "We'll start by gathering information, and I know where we can begin." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. The path ahead was uncertain, and the stakes were higher than anything he had ever imagined. But for the first time in his life, he understood that the future of Earth was no longer in the hands of governments or armies. It rested in his hands, and in the hands of a lone alien princess who had crashed into his life. And together, they would uncover the secrets of the shadows and fight to ensure that Earth had a future at all. Into the unknown. The night was thick with the promise of change. The snowstorm outside had begun to subside, the winds easing into a quiet lull as the first rays of morning light broke over the horizon. But inside Ethan's cabin, the air was charged with anticipation, with the sense that everything they had known was about to shift. Alia was up, standing by the window, her gaze fixed on the vast expanse of white beyond the cabin. Her posture was regal, but there was a tension in her movements that told Ethan she was far from at ease. She had been silent for most of the morning, her thoughts clearly elsewhere as she prepared for whatever was coming next. Ethan, ever the pragmatist, stood by the fire, trying to steady his nerves. He had spent the last few days gathering everything he could: research, equipment, anything that might help them in the struggle that lay ahead. But what had started as an unexpected encounter had evolved into something far more complicated and far more dangerous. The conspiracy Alia had warned him about was not just a political game. It was a war for the soul of the planet, and maybe even for the future of humanity itself. "We're going to need help," Ethan said quietly, breaking the silence between them. His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the urgency in his words. Alia turned to face him, her golden eyes piercing him as she took in his words. "I know," she replied, her voice steady, but filled with the weight of responsibility. "But the people we can trust are few. They're already watching us. Every move we make is under scrutiny." Ethan paused, trying to reconcile the enormity of the task before them. She was right. Alia's enemies, the shadowy organization that had sabotaged her mission and infiltrated Earth's power structures, had eyes everywhere. They controlled information, resources, and the political landscape. For them, a resistance, no matter how small, was a threat to be eradicated swiftly. "Then we need to be smarter," Ethan said, his tone firm. "We need to find a way to move in the shadows. We can't let them know we're coming for them." Alia gave a small nod, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Agreed. But we'll also need a way to communicate with my people. I don't have the resources to reach them from here, and I'm not sure I can trust anyone on Earth who's already in contact with them. The organization has far too many eyes, too many spies." Ethan thought for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of his chair. There was only one option, one avenue they hadn't explored yet. "The communication system in your ship," he said slowly. "Is it functional?" Alia's expression shifted. It was clear that the thought had crossed her mind, but she had hesitated. "I'm not sure. The ship was heavily damaged in the crash. But it's possible that some parts of the communication system are intact." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Then we need to go there. We need to assess the damage and see what we can salvage. If we can get a message out to your people, or even to anyone who can help us, it's our best shot." Alia considered his suggestion for a moment, her golden eyes narrowing as she weighed the risks. The ship had crashed miles away, buried deep in the snowdrifts, and the storm had left it nearly impossible to find. But the wreckage held the key to everything, and it was their only chance at making contact with the outside world. "All right," Alia said, her voice steady. "We'll go together. But we need to be prepared. If they're watching us, we can't afford any mistakes." Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. This was no longer just about saving a life or tending to an injury. This was a battle. A fight against an enemy that was far more powerful than anything he had ever faced. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a spy. But in this moment, he knew he had no choice but to rise to the challenge. The journey to the crash site would be perilous, made all the more dangerous by the remnants of the storm. The landscape was treacherous, and the wreckage was far from secure. Ethan had no idea what they would find when they reached the ship, but one thing was clear: their time was running out. Ethan gathered his supplies, medical gear, food, and tools to help them navigate the dangerous terrain. He didn't know what kind of communication system Alia's ship had, but they couldn't afford to waste time figuring it out. They had to get to the wreckage as quickly as possible. Alia, too, was ready. She had insisted on carrying her own weight, despite her injuries, and had donned the strange metallic armor-like attire she had worn when Ethan first found her. It wasn't just for protection. It seemed to serve as a sort of energy converter, drawing power from the environment around her. Ethan had watched her use it to heal herself faster than any human could, and he couldn't help but marvel at the alien technology that clung to her. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with concern. He had grown fond of Alia in the short time they had spent together, and the idea of her putting herself at risk again made him uneasy. "I have no choice," Alia replied, her tone resolute. "The longer we wait, the stronger they become. We can't let them win." With that, they set out into the cold, the wind biting at their skin as they trudged through the snow. The cabin, once a symbol of peace and solitude, now seemed far behind them. Ahead lay only uncertainty, dangerous, but necessary. The ship's wreckage waited for them, buried under miles of snow and ice, and with it the only hope they had left. As they walked, the weight of their mission hung between them, neither of them daring to speak it aloud. This was the point of no return. Once they reached the crash site, there would be no turning back. The fight for Earth's future would begin in earnest, and with every step they took, they moved closer to uncovering the truth that had been buried under layers of lies and deception for far too long. The ship of secrets. The journey through the snow was brutal. The storm had abated slightly, but the wind still howled, sharp and biting, cutting through their layers of clothing like icy daggers. Ethan and Alia moved with a sense of urgency, though neither spoke much as they fought their way through the knee-deep snow. Every step felt like a struggle, as though the very earth beneath them was pushing back against their every movement. Despite the harsh conditions, Alia seemed almost unaffected by the cold, her energy converter-like suit pulsing with soft, rhythmic hums that drew in the ambient heat from the surroundings. Ethan was impressed by her resilience, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. They needed to reach the ship before their enemies found them, before the conspiracy that had taken root on Earth could extend its reach any further. Ethan glanced over at Alia as they trudged forward. Her face, though pale from exhaustion, carried the same steely determination he had come to expect from her. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a leader, and right now, she was guiding them into the unknown, into the heart of a battle far larger than either of them could have imagined. Finally, after what felt like hours of walking against the wind, they crested a small ridge. There, partially buried beneath a thick blanket of snow, lay the wreckage of Alia's ship. The sight of it, broken and twisted, its once sleek and powerful form now reduced to a mangled heap, struck Ethan like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the destruction of the ship itself that hit him, but the realization that this was their last chance. If they didn't succeed here, there might be no hope left. Alia's pace quickened as she made her way down the ridge toward the wreckage. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, her instincts guiding her through the debris. Ethan followed closely behind, his boots crunching loudly in the silence, the only sound in a landscape that seemed frozen in time. When they reached the remains of the ship, Alia paused, her eyes scanning the twisted metal. She moved with purpose, kneeling beside a large piece of wreckage, where a faint pulse of light flickered through the cracks. "This is where we start," Alia said quietly, her voice strained. Ethan watched as she carefully pried apart the jagged metal, revealing a compartment that had once housed the ship's communication array. Alia's fingers danced across the exposed panel, her movements sure and practiced. "The system is still functional," she murmured. "Not fully intact, but enough for a signal." Ethan watched in awe as she manipulated the interface, her alien technology far beyond anything he had ever seen. It was like watching a symphony being played on a set of keys, each movement deliberate and precise. The air around them seemed to hum with energy as the ship's systems slowly began to power up, flickering lights illuminating the darkness of the wreckage. "I'll need a few minutes to stabilize the system," Alia said, her voice calm but filled with intensity. "But once I'm in, I can reach out to my people, send a distress signal, a beacon. It's our best chance." Ethan nodded, glancing nervously over their surroundings. He knew that it wouldn't be long before their enemies, the shadow organization Alia had warned him about, realized they were here. The storm had masked their movement, but now that they had reached the wreckage, they were exposed. Every minute counted. "Are you sure we can trust this?" Ethan asked, though part of him already knew the answer. There was no other option. Alia looked up from the console, her golden eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him feel as if she could see right through him. "I trust it," she said firmly. "The system is built to resist interference, but it's not indestructible. It's the only way we can reach my people, and it's the only way I can warn them of what's happening here." Ethan stood silently, his mind racing. The weight of their mission pressed heavily on him. The world he knew was slipping away, replaced by a new reality. A dangerous, unpredictable reality filled with conspiracies, alien forces, and enemies lurking in the shadows. He had spent his life as a healer, a protector, but now he was being thrust into a role he never imagined. That of a resistance fighter, a crucial part of a battle that could change the fate of Earth. "How much longer?" Ethan asked, his voice tense as he scanned the surroundings once more, his instincts on edge. Alia didn't look up as she continued her work, but her fingers moved faster now, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "A few minutes, if the ship's systems can hold together long enough. We're close." As if on cue, a low rumble echoed in the distance, followed by the faint sound of something heavy moving through the snow. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively reached for the medical bag slung across his shoulder, more out of habit than necessity. Alia, too, seemed to sense the approaching danger. She looked up sharply, her expression hardening. "They're here," she whispered, almost to herself. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had known the danger was coming, but the reality of it felt different. They were no longer just fighting for survival. They were fighting for the future of a planet that didn't even know it was under threat. Alia's fingers flew over the console, and the lights on the wreckage began to flicker more urgently. The hum of the ship's systems intensified as if answering her command. "I'm sending the signal now," she said, her voice low but filled with determination. "Once it's out, we need to move quickly. There's no telling how long the beacon will last before they detect it." The seconds felt like hours as Ethan glanced nervously toward the horizon, the sounds of the approaching enemy growing louder with each passing moment. His mind raced, searching for a way out, a way to protect Alia and himself from the storm that was closing in on them. And then, with a sudden surge of energy, the wreckage's communication system hummed to life, sending a pulse of light into the sky. The beacon was out. Alia looked up at Ethan, her golden eyes filled with quiet relief. "It's done," she said. "Now we wait." But as they turned to leave, a deep, resonant hum vibrated through the air. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble as the enemy's forces closed in, and the fight for survival, for Earth's future, was just beginning.